Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. This is a special end-of-year episode for Spectator TV viewers, and it's meant to be a treat for you because we've noticed at The Spectator, because we are observant people, we've noticed that you seem to really like clips of Douglas Murray. And so our producers here at The Spectator have assembled them all together from 2024 in a sort of Douglas Murray omnibus episode, which we hope you will enjoy. If you want to see the specific episode that you're watching in its entirety, you can click on the timestamp below. I think that makes sense. If it doesn't, just watch the whole thing. Enjoy. On this episode, we're going to be talking about Britain and free speech and hatred online. I am delighted to be joined by none other than Douglas Murray, our dear columnist, who has had a little bit of a taste of anti-free speech behaviour in the last few days, I think we can say. You are in America at the moment, Douglas.
I am.
I've been very struck by how many Americans are appalled at the limitations of free speech in Britain that we've seen in the days since the riots. We've seen judges very pompously sentencing people for writing often very shocking racist comments, but condemning them to prison for those comments. And to Americans, that seems very strange. Are you getting the same reaction from Americans you speak to?
Oh, yeah. I mean, people are amazed by it because, of course, in America, there's the protection of the First Amendment. And that has, by the way, a palpable effect on the discourse, including on the media discussion in the US, which is far less scared, I think, than most of the British media is, of dealing with, tricky people, difficult subjects. It is the case that the UK court system very often favors, for instance, rich plaintiffs. The American media doesn't worry about that sort of thing nearly so much because of the First Amendment, freedom of speech protection. And it has a very clear impact across the society. Now, maybe there are some people in Britain who think this increasing policing of what people say is a good thing. I would just point out that, nobody knows where the brakes are on that car. And all of the people celebrating this ridiculous behavior of the police and others in recent days should really consider what had happened if the boot was on the other foot. As you say, there are horrific and horrible things that people have passed around online. There are also things that are untrue. This, however, gets to something which is very interesting to me about the modern British political discourse, which is it never addresses primary problems. It always deals with reactive issues. When this appalling young man stabs 3 girls to death at a dance class, you can guess with complete accuracy that the British media, the British political class, will go on to some secondary or tertiary issue, usually to do with expression.
In that case, it would be that the concern was that the far right would leap on this as a kind of an example of illegal immigration, which of course it didn't turn out to be. But that was before even any details came out. The concern was that the far right would take this the wrong way before even the far right did.
But it's always like that. First of all, I mean, who is the organised far right in the UK? I mean, is there a British Nazi party? I don't see so. I think we saw it off the BNP 20 years ago. I think that actually one of the things that's happening, as I mentioned in my column, is that there is a genuine concern and an understandable concern from the authorities that these riots in recent weeks were actually not coordinated. They were ground up. They were not ordered by some Führer-like figure in the UK scene. They happened, and they happened out of, obviously, rage, and then led into, among other things, reprehensible criminality. But that's a much harder thing to deal with if you're dealing with a bottom-up expression of rage and rioting. That's very different from somebody ordering the rioting. So I think that this has caught the authorities off guard to a great extent. But this tendency to go, as I say, for things like let's police speech is just such a typically modern British thing. 2017, when the London Bridge attackers killed people on London Bridge and slashed the throats of pregnant women and much more. 3 men, by the way, who had no right to be in the UK. After that, if you remember, Theresa May and Sadiq Khan all stood together with a bunch of religious leaders and said that we must crack down on online discourse, which was sort of bewildering because there was no evidence. I mean, one of the guys at London Bridge appeared on a Channel 4 news program called My Neighbour the Jihadi. So it wasn't like he was, a sort of secretive figure who was lurking on online chat rooms. It's the same thing when Sir David Amess was killed. Was murdered a couple of years ago. You'll remember the conversation was not even how can we keep MPs safer. It was about online harms bills. And the man who murdered Sir David Amess, there's no evidence that there was anything to do with an online harms issue. It's what the British police and political class think they can always come down on. Always come down on speech, always talk about the terrible internet, always talk about the terrible freedom of expression that people are exercising. I think it's a demonstration of their own failure to deal with primary issues and their own sort of eunuch-like status on so many things.
And I suppose it's sort of easy to police because there's always records of what's happened online and you can always just go through someone's Twitter account. Yeah. Any journalist can do it, so presumably any police officer can do it too.
Oh, absolutely. And it's the loveliest day's policing, of course, is to sit at your desk eating a digestive biscuit and a cup of coffee and scrolling through Twitter to find if a woman somewhere in Doncaster has liked something that she shouldn't have done on Twitter. I mean, as I mentioned in my column, and I've rather banged on quite a lot about in recent years, there are huge numbers of police forces, by the way, particularly in the north of England, that have not solved one burglary in recent years. Not one. And as many homeowners have written to me and told me, they can even say to the police, I have CCTV of the burglars, and the police don't bother to look into it, and they don't prosecute anyone. These same forces are now rampaging through Twitter because it is so much easier for them.
Well, and certainly people I know in London who've experienced burglary, they'd say that they're very good at the pastoral side of things. So you get, a mental health person will come and talk to you about how you've been mentally affected by the burglary.
Yes.
But nobody looks into whether you...
Yes, but the best thing to say if you've been robbed is to tell them that you feel sad about it, amazingly enough, and sometimes feel very sad about it. But if you say, and I'd like my wallet back,
they
can't help. Such a shame.
Well, you mentioned that there isn't really an organised far right, and I think you're right about that. But I wonder what you made of that counter protest last week. Was it Wednesday or Thursday night last week? Which was all about. It was in reaction to this rumour that went around. There was going to be 100 far right riots in very improbable places like Walthamstow, and all these people came out to march against it. And it was then presented on the front pages of all the newspapers as a kind of expression of disgust at the far right that we're not really sure exists, but that was what the story was. Did you think that felt like something organised? Because there's a lot of conspiracy theorists on the right who think it was a kind of psy-op, as they call it.
It could well have been. It didn't need to be, but it could well have been. I mean, there are a bunch of groups in the UK who make their money from saying they are anti-fascist. By the way, all of these groups behave in very fascistic ways themselves, it should be noticed. But it's also always been the question that I've had in Britain, certainly since the destruction of the BNP, is who are you tilting against? Who are you running against? And the answer was, for a long time for these groups, was that the bogeyman of the far right had basically been certainly seen off from British politics. But what they did was they continued to raise money about it, continued to scare people about it, and moved the barrier of where far right should be said to be just further and further, closer and closer into the political mainstream. So that, for instance, these groups started to campaign against UKIP, against Nigel Farage, against the Brexit Party, against reform. And then, of course, against individual Conservative MPs. Suella Braverman was meant to be a classic example for a while of the far-right Obersturmführer, jackboot-wearing, goose-stepping, typical skinhead. I mean, look at these people. They're a disgrace for whipping people up like this. And as for whipping up people in immigrant areas and others about the idea that there was some Nazi party of Great Britain about to, I mean, the problem with these people is that they are so hot for expressing bravery and their political the beauty of their political thoughts by, for instance, being anti-Nazi. Sorry, guys, in the 1940s, it took bravery to be anti-Nazi. In the 1930s, it took bravery to be anti-Nazi. There is no bravery about it today. But, you know, they're fighting a sort of phantom bogeyman. And you can see they're desperate to have their Cable Street moment. They're desperate for that, these people. They have non partisan they hold up, as if, you know, Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists might be just lurking around the corner and about to come and do a parade. It's preposterous, and among other things, it's also a complete double standard, because, as we all know, if you, for instance, write a piece about a terrorist who attended a certain mosque, you would never be allowed to, and nor should you say that everyone at that mosque, therefore, is a terrorist. Oh, but if a white working class person is upset about anything, let alone a large number of white working class people, bang, far right, like that. No way to express anger, frustration, or anything else without being deemed to be far right. I think this is a big mistake that the political class and the media in the UK have made. And the media who've been willing to suck up to that should realize that all these people, all these fake anti-fascists, all of whom have very dubious histories themselves, all of these fake anti-fascist groups tilting at this fascist enemy are staggering around the land looking for fascists to identify. They will come for whoever is in their way and make these charges against them. They are totally unscrupulous. They are tin can waving money raisers and total frauds. And I wish more people called that out.
Well, before we get ourselves into big trouble for saying unacceptable things, I hear what you're saying, that the far right is essentially a bogeyman that kind of unites the anti-fascist movement. But nevertheless, there were attempts to set fire to a hotel.
Yes,
there was an attack on a mosque. And these things are not pleasant. Let's just clarify for those people who think that you approve of these things.
Terrible.
That those are terrible things. Yeah.
Nobody could possibly condone behavior like that. It's completely reprehensible. Is it an expression of a political ideology? I doubt it. Is it a coherent right-left thing? I wouldn't think so. When governments and others badly let down the people in their country, there are always eruptions, and you have to deal with them. And, I sort of would hope that the British government would, like any other government, and stop people being intimidated in their homes and much more. One of the problems about mobs is that they don't know how to behave, rather obviously, and they direct themselves onto just whatever is in front of them. But I mean, I think that this attempt to use that as a way to claim that Britain has some kind of organized far right is a real mistake. It's a category error. I think also it's just extremely unfair to people who are not violent, the ones who are not violent and never did anything violent, but are deeply worried about what has happened to their communities and their country. When obviously there is no place for the violence. What if you are anti the violence, but you desperately want to make your voice heard in some way? Are you allowed to even protest in the UK anymore without the Antifa groups claiming that you're a fascist for doing so? What are you allowed to do exactly if you're white and working class and live in an area like Southport and don't like some of the things that have gone on recently? What are you allowed to do? The answer is you're allowed to vote every 5 years. Great. And what's the result of that? Nothing for a quarter of a century. If you voted, for instance, against mass migration for a quarter of the century, you have voted and had your vote completely ignored. So the political class should not think that the great panacea to this is to say to people, once every 5 years, you're allowed to express yourself at the ballot box. There are lots of ways of expressing yourself. You and I happen to have the opportunity and platforms to do so, to speak, to write, and so on. Not everybody does. And I just deeply worry that now any political expression, online or off, by somebody who does not like the direction of their country, is going to be deemed to be far right and part of this fascist movement that, as far as I can see, does not exist in the UK.
Do you think then there is a genuine victim mindset emerging among, it's an unfortunate phrase, but people use it, the white working class? Or do you think the white working class only know how to express themselves through the identity politics of saying, well, we have rights too, just like minorities do?
Well, I wrote in my column last week, it's just so sad what has been done to our country by Labour and by the Conservatives and by the Liberal Democrats. It is so sad. Look at the hopelessness that comes from joblessness. Everybody knows that. Everybody. This isn't a left-right issue. It is. You are living a hopeless life if you have no employment and have no means of employment, no likelihood of employment. And if you go through the stats, the unemployment stats for the areas of the north of England that we've all been reading about in recent weeks, these are areas where joblessness has increased among the native population over the last 13 years. Increased. These are areas where, to the extent that there has been any improvement in jobs and job availability, 3/4 of those jobs have gone to foreign-born workers. Now, this used to be, by the way, a left-wing issue as well. The left-wing trade unions used to be against the mass migration because they recognized that it pushed down the salaries of labor in the country. Well, when did you last hear any Labour politician representing any of these areas talking about that? They don't dare. They just leave these people behind. They actually abandon them. And they do nothing to improve their lives. And then on top of everything else, because of a few numbskulls who do reprehensible things and rioting, you're also far right if you just have a concern in these areas. I think it's appalling, the lack of just basic human empathy with people in these places. And Westminster seems to have no empathy for these people. And having abandoned them and ignored them, it now wants to spit in their faces as well.
Well, and it seems to be almost a class thing, but also a kind of intellectual thing. So you could be a highbrow. I mean, I know we'll get onto this in a second. You people went after you at the weekend for an interview that you did, and we'll talk about that in a second. But in your column this week, you talk about how if there's a sort of impression among the left liberal establishment that you are a bit thick and a bit poor and you're saying terrible things online, then we can come after you. But they don't. They're more nervous about doing it with people who are in a position to defend themselves. They go after the most vulnerable with the online abuse stuff.
Well, I think that's, as I quoted my column this week, as Rowan Atkinson said, this is rather to be expected, that people with a platform and the ability to defend themselves will do so. And people without much of a platform, with no ability to defend themselves and no defenders in the public square, will be just left by the wayside. I mean, you have seen a few people, complete dolts like Jonathan Freedland of The Guardian, talking about the necessity of, I think, extraditing Elon Musk to the UK.
Yeah.
Good luck with that, guys. Good luck with that. It's pathetic. Again, these people, they have no interest in the primary problems, but they'll come down on their tough on Elon Musk, tough on the causes of Elon Musk columns. I've had a bit of it. It's water off a duck's back, of course, but a few sort of rampaging online lunatics like Alistair Campbell have tried to say that I should be in trouble because I predicted all this.
Yes.
And have said so. And that's pretty remarkable, actually. Of course, as Thomas Sowell famously said, people will forgive you for being wrong, but they'll never forgive you for being right. And I was right on mass migration and integration, and Alistair Campbell was flat out wrong. He was part of the Labour government that put massive boosters under the legal and illegal immigration into the UK in the late 90s and early 2000s. He was part of the Blair government that did that. It's quite extraordinary to see somebody like him who caused these challenges and problems to our country, trying to crack down on the people who noticed it. Really, I mean, if he wasn't such a sick individual, it would be funny.
But I mean, let's just clarify for people who might not have followed this. It was an interview that you gave in November that was chiefly passed around, and you were talking about in October, last year, and you were talking about Hamas protesters, pro-Hamas protesters, chiefly, were you not?
Yep. And Hamas leaders, more importantly, in the UK, because what people don't seem to realize is that terrorist leaders and others, including the former Deputy Prime Minister of Iran, live in the UK. This is something that astonishes me, and the British authorities have done nothing about. You can call for the murder of a British novelist, and the British novelist is unsafe, Salman Rushdie, but the person who called for his murder lives perfectly safely in the UK. What? Why does the UK allow the former Hamas military leader to live in the UK? What's he brought the country? And that's the point I made last October. And a few totally either ignorant or very stupid people picked it up and said that I'd said this about the recent riots and was saying this about all immigrants. I mean, it was so preposterous. But, you know, all these people who talk about fake news and disinformation, you can set your watch. They're all people who pass around disinformation like that themselves. That's what people like Alistair Campbell have spent the last week doing, Kenan Malik of The Observer, you know, all these characters who talk about disinformation and the importance of truth. They pass around disinformation all the time. They've done it about me in recent days. They're such hypocrites and hacks. Fortunately, I don't think they have any impact, actually, outside their own deranged circles of friends. Well, friends such as they have, I'm sure.
I mean, you faced a few Twitter storms in your life, I think it's fair to say. Where would you rank this on the scale of Twitter storms that you've faced?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't really care about storms unless they're real. You know? I mean, I take very little interest in what people say about me online, because if I did take an interest about it, I wouldn't get any work done.
Yes.
So no, I mean, you know, Twitter storms are just one of those things that come and go, and that I suppose a writer has to just accept them. But I'm much more worried about the reality. I'm much more worried about the reality in Britain, that, you know, everything that was promised to the voters, they've been let down. And this recent terrible riots and things will give the political class, as far as I can see, an excuse to further ignore the troubles in our country.
But the reason I ask about Twitter storms is not just puerile interest, or there's a bit of that, but it's that Elon Musk now runs X, Twitter, and it is now such a hated platform, and yet it is still the platform that informs the public conversation more than any other.
It's the number one news source in the world.
Yes. And people are...
Well, that's annoying for the BBC and co, isn't it?
People can't bear it. And I wonder what you think is going to happen there, because let's say Kamala Harris wins in November, which is not unfeasible. Keir Starmer in Britain, other governments may decide that they need to shut down Twitter, X, Elon Musk, because he is poisoning the discourse.
Yeah, they've tried this sort of thing for years, as I say. They always focus on the response and the speech, and not on the things that people are responding to and speaking about. Absolutely guaranteed. If you want to solve some of the problems that America is going through, you stop the movement of millions of illegal migrants into the US across the southern border. If you want to address the real problems going on in the US, you do that, you address the economy, you tackle inflation. Same thing in the UK. If you want to solve the problems in the UK, you stop having historically high net legal and illegal migration. You grow the economy, you tackle inflation, you make sure that the money in people's wallets goes further than it is at the moment. These are not impossible challenges. The borders are not an impossible challenge at all. Straightforward. We used to have borders. We used to have them. And so some of these ones are not that difficult. Some are relatively difficult. Inflation's relatively difficult to get under control, but you can. We could have a sensible energy policy, for instance, in the US and UK. That would do an enormous amount to bring down the inflation. But these things are harder, all of them are harder than saying, Twitter, X, Elon Musk. It's just, and we shouldn't allow the politicians to get away with that. I just don't think we should. We shouldn't allow them to get away with continuously diverting us from their failure to tackle the things we have tasked them with tackling.
Ultimately, is it nobody really cares about rhetoric?
I think very little. I mean, as a devotee of the art myself, I regret this fact. But no, I mean, it's not about the speech. It's about the facts. It's about the facts. You could silence every single person in Hartlepool. You could ban anyone in Southport from being allowed to use social media. And you still wouldn't have stopped the boats coming over every day of smuggling gangs bringing in illegals into the UK who should not be there and have no right to be there. These people in charge are so dishonest to keep on tackling not the sources of their own failure, but other people's objection to that failure.
Douglas Murray, I think we'll end it there. But sadly, Alistair Campbell didn't join us today, but I'm sure we'll get him on.
I'm told he's doing one of those things where he goes around rapaciously bullying people and then says that he feels sad himself and so nobody must criticize him. Brilliant 1-2 punch, that. It's a great bit of narcissistic manipulation.
Now, Douglas, you write your column this week about two underreported stories about the Israel-Hamas conflict. Tell us about them.
Well, yes, it's extraordinary to me that at the same time the world is understandably talking about the refugees in Gaza, there is almost no international attention on the tens of thousands of Israeli families who are refugees within Israel. The Israeli government doesn't like to call them refugees. They are known as internally displaced people. But these are the tens of thousands of people from the north of Israel who were moved south on October the 7th and who cannot return to their homes because they're all being regularly assaulted by rockets from Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon. And of course, also people from the south of Israel who were moved out on the 7th by the Israeli government because they're also under rocket fire from Gaza. These people get absolutely no attention on them. I mentioned a bit about this in the piece. It's very striking to me why that is. The second thing that I mentioned in the piece that's almost completely unreported upon in the press outside of Israel is the fact that, as I say in my column this week, in my view, the war may well have not yet begun. And what I mean by that is that Hamas is in British car terms, the Ford Cortina of Iran. It's being smashed, and in my view, I hope that it's smashed completely. I think there's no point, as the Minister Benny Gantz said this week, of putting out 3/4 of a fire. You either put out the whole of a fire, or you don't bother. And the way in which David Cameron and others this week have been calling on Israel to effectively stop fighting the fire is, I think, profoundly unhelpful. But if Hamas is the Ford Cortina proxy of Iran, Hezbollah is its Lamborghini, and by that I mean that this is about 160,000 much higher grade missiles that Hezbollah has stored in the south of Lebanon, in an area that, of course, after the 2006 war, the UN passed a resolution that was meant to be demilitarized and stripped of such rockets. But, of course, the international community didn't abide by that resolution, 1701. And so, in my view, as long as because these two things connect, as long as the citizens of Israel cannot live in their homes in the north of the country, this war cannot be over. And then the real war is the much bigger war against Hezbollah, the other proxy of Iran, in southern Lebanon. And I'm not sure that outside of the region, it's widely understood that this is the situation. When I hear comments from Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron and others, you might get the impression that the Gaza war is all there is to this. And that is such a massive miscalculation, a demonstration of ignorance of the actual situation.
You're also right in terms of different angles which haven't really been covered on this conflict, about the tens of thousands of Israelis who've been displaced and lost their homes. Tell us about that.
Well, I say there that, I mean, these are people for whom there seems to be no particular international notice or international sympathy. I've lived among them for some months, and it's a terrible thing. I mean, many of them have been put up in hotels by the Israeli government, and some people might say, well, that sounds okay. Actually, it might be fun to live with your whole family in a hotel room for a week. It's not much fun for months on end, let alone if it's clear that you can't return to your home for the foreseeable future. These are all children missing out on their educations, or at least missing out on much of their education. People unable to do their work, farmers unable to tend to their crops or fields. I'm just sort of startled by the fact that this gets so little attention. And one of the only things I think justifies or explains why it is because, of course, these people are being looked after by the Israeli government. They're Israeli citizens, Israeli civilians of a bewildering array of backgrounds and religions. But they are Israeli civilians being looked after by the Israeli government. I suppose that as the world watches what's happening in Gaza, perhaps it thinks, that Israel also has to have all total control and responsibility for all Gazan civilians. But actually, of course, the civilians of Gaza were meant to be under the protection of Hamas and the governance of Hamas. But then we can see how well that worked out. But yes, I mean, in a way, the Israeli displaced are being ignored because their government is actually looking after them.
Ironic. And what would an escalation in northern Israel look like? You talk about, the border there. Hezbollah has around 160,000 rockets on the border there. What would any escalation in that region look like?
Well, I've been up there a lot recently, as I have over the years. I was there during the 2006 conflict 18 years ago, as Hezbollah was shelling the north of Israel and rocketing it. And I've been up there quite a lot in recent months, in places like Mount Meron and Metula and Kiryat Shimona and elsewhere. And I can tell you that both sides, both Hezbollah and Israel, have an interest in downplaying the amount of activity on that border. But I can tell you from my own eyewitness that there's a lot more activity than anyone is admitting. Artillery, air assaults, rockets being fired regularly by Hezbollah, RPGs, anti-tank, much more. The whole area is an absolute tinderbox. And as I was up on Mount Meron the other week, actually, 4 Hamas fighters, consider that doesn't get much attention. 4 Hamas from Lebanon crossed the border into Israel on a mission to kill Israelis, and they were killed themselves, and they injured quite a lot of IDF. But these things get almost no international notice. But if you go to a place like Metula, a small town which is surrounded on three sides by Hezbollah, you can see the Hezbollah bases. They're absolutely everywhere. The Hezbollah listening posts, the Hezbollah rocket bases. These are all there. And I reiterate, it's so strange because, 18 years after I was last seeing that there, and 18 years after that conflict was meant to have ended with this not happening, and with the international community ensuring that Hezbollah could not have this knife at Israel's throat, there it is, bigger and better and glossier than ever, Hezbollah's armory in Lebanon. And this is, of course, a tragedy for Lebanon, among other things. Hezbollah has helped to ruin that country. But yes, the eradication of this arsenal has to happen at some point. One Israeli told me a little while ago that he thought there was maybe a 30% chance, 30% chance of there actually being a diplomatic solution to this, i.e., the international community might actually enforce its own resolution and persuade Hezbollah to remove its arsenals from the area that's meant to be demilitarized. But that, as math geniuses will have noticed, is a minority, therefore, likelihood. It's much more likely that Hezbollah and Israel are on a kind of tandem bicycle cycling downhill, and whoever stops pedaling first, we don't know, but it's going to crash. I think a lot of people outside the region don't realize that there's basically two reasons why Hezbollah has this weaponry in the south of Lebanon. One is just to use it at any point or at some point against Israel. And as I say, it's using it a lot. Just the other night, they fired a barrage of about 50 or 60 missiles. They keep on testing the Iron Dome. There were 30 again the other day. It's pretty extraordinary to see. But yes, these pretty significant barrages go off on a regular basis now, are mainly shot down, but are not always shot down by Israel's Iron Dome. But maybe that is why Hezbollah has this buildup of weaponry. But there's a second reason, of course, which is that it exists there in order to be used or have the threat of using it at such a time as Israel, America, or any other international force in any way struck Iran, the revolutionary Islamic government in Iran, in order to stop it getting to the final point of its long-desired nuclear ambitions. If there were a strike against Iran by Israel, by America, or others to stop it getting to the final stage of getting a nuclear bomb, which, as I say, the regime in Tehran has been very clear that it has wanted for decades now, if there was such a strike, arguably that's when Iran would get Hezbollah to start firing. And people shouldn't underestimate this threat, both the Iranian nuclear threat, which lots of people have put to the back of their minds in recent years, but is still going on, still very much the ambition of the regime in Tehran. So the first thing is that they shouldn't underestimate that. And the second thing is they shouldn't underestimate the nature of the arsenal of weaponry in Hezbollah that Hezbollah owns and has stored in southern Lebanon. Many of these are much more advanced missiles than the ones that Hamas has had, partly, of course, because although there wasn't a successful blockade on stopping rockets getting into Gaza, there was some blockade. But the Lebanese Hezbollah have Iranian weaponry of a pretty high caliber that could reach much, if not most, of Israel. And that's just an intolerable situation for any country to live under. And as I say, these two issues, if you bring them together, the displaced people in the north of Israel and the munitions that Hezbollah has stockpiled pointing in their direction, you see that, as I say in the column this week, arguably, the war in the Middle East has not yet begun. Everything we've had so far is a prelude.
Today, we're going to be talking about the power of Elon Musk, because Elon Musk, as the world's richest man, is very much in the news at the moment due to his close budding friendship with Donald Trump, the re-elected president of the United States. Douglas Murray, the Spectator's very own Douglas Murray, has written a cover piece this week called Planet Elon, in which he explores this extraordinary relationship between the two men and what it might mean for American politics and the world. Douglas, it's easy to forget that not so long ago, and in fact still, I think, Elon Musk will refer to himself as a moderate Democrat, that 16 years ago he queued up to meet Barack Obama and shake his hand, that only in May last year he launched a SpaceX with Ron DeSantis, suggesting that he was at least open to the idea of Ron DeSantis as the Republican nominee and not Donald Trump. And yet, by August of this year, he was doing a SpaceX with Donald Trump. And since then, the two men seem to have become closer and closer, so much so that some people are worried now that Elon Musk has perhaps too much of a hold over Donald Trump. What do you put down? Where do you think that relationship began, that closeness began? What in Elon Musk's mind changed?
I think all we can really go on is the public record, and that shows that it was the would-be assassin's bullet in Butler, Pennsylvania, that changed everything. As I say in the piece, the cover piece in the Spectator this week, that attempted assassination of Donald Trump on stage, that incredibly near miss, had a lot of consequences, which historians will ruminate on. But one of the most powerful was that there was an immediate response from Elon Musk and some others. Bill Ackman is another example of people who just saw this moment, saw how perilously close America had come to an absolute catastrophe, saw Donald Trump's response to that very close shave and his fight, and decided that even if they'd been teetering before or wondering about a public endorsement, now was the time to get behind former President Trump. And Bill Ackman did that in a tweet. Elon Musk did it in a tweet. And in a way, that changed everything. And one of the things it changed was that, first of all, Elon Musk showed that he was all in with Trump. And when Elon Musk is all in, he really is all in. And he didn't just commit his considerable resources to the campaign. He encouraged others to join him in funding for the Trump campaign. But most crucially, in a way, was that he actually put his time into campaigning with and for Donald Trump. And that really had an enormous effect on the campaign. I think that the world's richest man is the sort of most obvious label for him, but he deserves, in a way, a different label, which, I mean, the world's greatest innovator. This is a man who, as I mentioned a few weeks ago in The Spectator, parallel parked a rocket in his spare time. And so he's an aspirational figure as well as an inspirational figure for a lot of people. And I think him throwing himself all in behind Trump just had a huge add-on effect to the already growing Trump campaign.
There was a lot of talk in the run-up to the election, and indeed since, about Trump's appeal to men. And in talking about the shooting there, we are talking about a very male reaction to masculine virtues. And it's interesting that seems to be a growing force among liberals, among Democrats, this sort of recognition that manly attributes are important.
Well, yes. I mean, it's funny to be in a world where that's surprising. It's only because of the weird sort of white dudes for Kamala sort of fakery, where there was an attempt to pretend that the most important thing in this election was for white dudes to fight for their daughter to be able to abort their grandchild faster or later. That seemed a strange appeal to voters. Yes, I mean, I think that to a great extent there is a reaction to a massive overreach on the part of the left. The overreach was, of course, all of the gender woo-woo nonsense of recent years, all this just stupid time wasting, all of the rudeness, the just horrible language that was used against men. And not just language, but I mean hiring and much more. It being perfectly possible for people to say, we need more women, or we need fewer white men, or all of this sort of thing. It was incredibly divisive, very racist. And of course, I mean, it's impossible to imagine it happening any other way round. I mean, if you advertised, if you said, we need lots more men in this particular industry and women shouldn't apply, I think we'd hear from women a bit about that. And so, yes, there was this massive overreach by the left against men. And now there's a reaction to that. But yes, I mean, it's also a thing of serious times needing serious people and some serious courage. It turned out that much of this election was between Donald Trump getting back up on stage after being shot in the ear and saying, fight, 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 and Kamala laughing crazily at jokes that hadn't been made. You sort of look out at the world, and it's not hard to think, who on the world stage do you want representing you? Somebody who talks tough, or somebody who seems, well, I mean, how can you say it without being sexist or being accused of sexism? But who, frankly, a lot of people in the American public seemed to behave like a wine mom, and always seemed to be a couple of glasses of Chardonnay down, and you just couldn't get anything out of ideas wise or policy wise. Yeah, there was somebody who was a former supporter of Trump's, who I happened to be with shortly after the assassination attempt, and she was not for Trump in recent years. But I remember she said to me, that was so darn, masculine. That was so darn, alpha. That's what we need.
Yeah. You talk about seriousness there, and obviously Elon Musk is a very serious businessman in terms of his success, and Donald Trump is a very serious politician, or businessman turned politician, in terms of his success. But there also is a deep silliness within both of them, and I don't mean that in a critical way. They do enjoy having fun, they enjoy memes, and they seem to understand what works online. And is there this odd combination of sort of silliness and seriousness that seems to be driving the new Trump coalition?
I don't know if I put it like that, but I mean, it's true that, one of the things that people have always, you've written about this before, Freddie, they've always massively underestimated about Trump is that he's very funny. And one of the reasons why people queued for years to hear him speak, sometimes for hours, was because they liked hearing him riff. And they liked him going off on, what does he call them, weaves,
yeah.
Going on to, and commenting on some idiotic thing said on The View or something, and they liked that. And of course, the Trump critics always sort of said, "Aha, he's rambling," or he said this thing. They took things that he said that were obviously jokes, and they made them into just literal claims, which they could then attack him on, like the claim that when he said, Russia, are you listening? I want Hillary's emails, sort of thing. It was a joke, and the Democrats some years ago sort of decided to make that into oh my gosh, this is the candidate actually begging the Russians publicly to hack the Democrat. I mean, it was, so there's lots of things like that they underestimated Trump on. And Elon Musk, I mean, it's a bit different. He's very open about the fact that, as he's occasionally said, his side hustle is as a comedian. Yeah, he's one of those sort of tech people who understands memes. He understands better than anyone. He understands not just the internet, but internet culture, social media culture. And he's obviously had an enormous amount of fun for many years now. Riling people up with some of that stuff. I mean, Elon Musk only needs to retweet something, and the whole British commentariat and some of the Labour Party would go completely bananas, and it becomes a news story in the UK.
Well, I first of all, Douglas, I think you need to work on your weave. I've been meaning to say this to you for a while. Your answers are far too direct. You need to master the weave. Secondly, I wanted to say, without getting po-faced about this, because obviously the silliness is fun, and Elon Musk is an entertaining figure as well as a very interesting one. But there are some legitimate concerns, are there not, with having the world's richest man being quite so intimately involved as he seems to have been in recent days with an incoming American administration. I mean, there are inevitable conflicts of interest there. And it's not just boring liberals who are upset about that.
Sure, absolutely. But I mean, the president-elect can have who he wants on his team. And I mean, when it comes to the Department of Government Efficiency, which Elon Musk, along with Vivek Ramaswamy, looks like he will be in charge of, this is a very serious project, and it does actually need an outsider to do it. This is something which the so-called Conservative government in the UK in the past 14 years occasionally tried to do, which was cut government waste. They were never very good at it. And one reason why was because they tended to have people who had never been in business in government being advised by civil servants who didn't particularly care about business. And it was very hard to do things like cutting government waste. That's why the NHS is about the biggest employer in the world, apart from the army of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, but in America, this is a very serious problem. America has a deficit roughly equivalent to roughly equivalent to Spain's annual budget. And the claim that Elon Musk made at the rally at Madison Square Garden, among other places, the other week, he might be able to shave $2 trillion off the federal spending in the US, would have an enormous impact, not just on business, on taxpayers, and much more. It would have an important influence because that government waste in the US, like in the UK, is not just a waste of money. It's a waste of money plus very anti-American ideology inserted into it. Just like we have government waste plus anti-British ideology built into it in the UK. This includes things like, the education budget in the US, the Department of Education, the unbelievable hold of people like Randy Weingarten, head of the teaching union, who Mike Pompeo, I think, accurately described some time ago as the most dangerous person in America. Somebody who globetrots and who oversees an education system in the US, which, as President Trump said the other day, it spends more than almost any other country in the world on the education of its children, and it has one of the worst education outcomes. I mean, I'm sitting at the moment in New York State, and in New York State in recent years, it was at one point during COVID up to almost $30,000 a pupil per year was being spent on education. And if you look at the education attainment rates, K through 12, it's only just a slight majority, literally just above 50% of students who leave K through 12 with basic numeracy, and only just over 50% of students coming out of that system with basic literacy. That's worse than educational attainment rates in many African countries, with a tiny percentage of the same spending per pupil. Why is that? It has to be sorted out. And arguably, Elon Musk, among others, is a very good person to do that, because they need to strip out not just the waste, but also the horrible ideology which is behind part of the waste.
There's quite a few people in Silicon Valley, not just Elon Musk, who have been on a similar journey as he has, against ideology, against a left liberal ideology, if you like. And I think they're pushing America towards perhaps a different kind of democratic politics, where someone like Elon Musk can be openly involved in government. And it's, there are, as we've said, there is a potential for conflict of interest. There's a lot of potential for corruption there. But it's a rather different model to what we've had in the past, particularly under democratic administrations, where the big money is very much in the background.
Oh, I don't think it's in the background at all in the Democratic Party. Absolutely not. I mean, look at the amazing Twitter or X feed of Alex Soros. Yeah. Look at the photographs he gets with every single leading Democrat. Do you think Alex Soros gets all those photographs by having pulled himself up by his bootstraps and made something of himself in this world? Or no, of course not. I mean, the money in the Democratic Party and the ideology of it has been at least as obvious as this. So no, I mean that is nothing new. As for Silicon Valley figures, I mean, since Silicon Valley is responsible for so much of the success of the stock market, why would you not want the highest people involved in the highest performing companies in the world to have some say in government, at least to advise it? I mean, it would seem to me to be obvious. I mean, only in Britain do we have this idea that you should invite the biggest dolts and failures in your country to advise the government. Britain, has these convulsions over, gosh, what will we do without Sue Gray? Meantime, it's a good idea to have the best and brightest and most successful figures advising government. Yes, absolutely.
But there is perhaps a tension, is there not, between, if you think about the biggest Silicon Valley successes, they are companies that are huge in size, but not necessarily in the number of jobs they create. And if you have...
Well, that's not true with Tesla. I mean, Tesla's an amazing job creator.
That's not true of Tesla, and it's not true of SpaceX. But generally, something like Google or Twitter, X, which Musk now owns, doesn't actually need that many employees. Oh. And yet it's a very powerful and lucrative company. I just wonder if there will be a tension between Silicon Valley people being so involved in government and a Trump administration that's committed to reindustrialization.
I don't know. We'll see. I mean, there's always tensions. But no, I mean, I don't think so. I think that people will... I think the most important thing you can do is to have a government of as many talents as possible. And, would that we had that in the UK. I think there was a very interesting point that a number of people, including Miranda Devine, the New York Post, pointed out, I think around the time of Madison Square Gardens, actually, which is how interesting it was seeing the array of people who were on stage with Trump this time. It wasn't just family, it wasn't just Republicans. It was a sometimes quite bewildering and often very funny array of people. And I'm assuming, by the way, that Hulk Hogan, who gave a rip-roaring performance at Madison Square Gardens, I'm assuming he won't have any actual role in the administration. But it was very interesting watching, the coalition. Somebody presented, I think it was Miranda, as like the X-Men or the Avengers or something. Watching, Tulsi Gabbard and Elon Musk and RFK Jr. and Dr. Phil, and it was very interesting because it suggested, in the campaign that it wasn't just about voting for Trump this time. It was that Trump plus the people he had put around him just had this much broader appeal. And anyhow, it's going to be very interesting. Yes, you're right, Freddie. There will be tensions for sure. I mean, there always are. But I mean,
I think it's more. It's WrestleMania, really, isn't it? It's and that's the influence perhaps of Linda McMahon and Vince McMahon, who are of course the WWF family. But introducing the cast of characters like that, and Dana White, of course, who was on that stage, is UFC. But let's get away from that, because even though that is fascinating, we're running out of time. I just want to ask you lastly about Twitter and X, because you mentioned this in your piece. X, I should say, formerly Twitter. Elon Musk's buying of Twitter and turning it into X, how significant do you think that purchase was for free speech, for this election, for the future of the free world, if we can call it that still?
Oh, I mean, it was astonishing. I had quite a close seat to some of what was going on in that period, and it was an astonishing move by Musk. He ended up paying, what was it, 44 billion, 42, 44, I can't remember at the end, for Twitter. And I think it has had a huge impact, because what Parag and the others who were running Twitter before Musk bought it didn't ever really concede was that they were the town square, that Twitter had effectively become the town square, the city square. And sometimes if you spoke to those people in private, they say, we never said we wanted to be the town square. Who made us that? Well, you just ended up being that. And the thing was that the rules of the town square kept changing. And then we discovered that the town square was being policed by total maniacs, and that it was being policed by extraordinary ideologues. It was not just the town square. It wasn't like Speaker's Corner in the UK. It was Speaker's Corner with like the Basij militia standing on the sides trying to take people out if they erred and strayed from their ways. I mean, the combination of the way in which Twitter before Elon Musk was banning and muting conservative or center-right as well as right-wing voices, the fact that they had kicked Donald Trump himself off the platform, plus the fact that they were dampening stories and stopping stories getting out. Don't forget that the people who talked about election interference in 2020, the New York Post, for which I write, the New York Post broke the Hunter Biden laptop story, which was not just a story about dick pics or something. It was a story about corruption in the first family. And when the New York Post broke that story, Twitter was one of the platforms that stopped the New York Post's account, that blocked it. This was massive election interference, which the Democrats and others have still not conceded was the case. So the town square was not a free place. It was a completely ideologically captured space by the left in America, by this weirdo left, what's more, in America, of the kind of people whose main occupation seems to be to desire to trans children, which, by the way, is something that Musk himself obviously feels very strongly about, and understandably and rightly. No, these weird freaks in California were effectively responsible for policing what the world could know and say. And so when Musk took it over and fired all these ridiculous content moderator types who were so inept at their job, even if anyone could do it, he completely freed up the platform. It freed up speech globally. X is now the main news source for the world. And it had a huge effect. So more than 40 billion was laid out. It turns out to have been a relatively cheap price for the effect that it's had.
A snip. But, I mean, it also instantly made him, he was getting a little bit unpopular in some quarters, but it made him a real figure of hatred on the left globally. And we see today that The Guardian has pulled itself off Twitter, or will no longer be posting under the Guardian handle.
Oh, how will we cope, Freddie?
I don't know. The public square is ruined. But it will be interesting. It will be interesting to see. Just lastly, Douglas, sorry, about Truth Social and Twitter, because I don't think Donald Trump. He started tweeting again during the campaign. I don't think since the election victory, he has yet tweeted on Twitter X, because he wants to promote Truth Social. So perhaps there'll be a tension there. I don't know.
I think Donald Trump has many other things to preoccupy himself in the 4 years ahead.
I think Truth Social's very, very high in his thinking.
But just quickly on the thing of people turning against Elon Musk, is a very interesting thing that I mentioned. The piece, of course, Peter Thiel came out for Trump in 2016. It was very, very early on that, and took a certain amount of flack in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. But the hatred expressed about Elon Musk on the left is the hatred that the left always has of somebody who they think is an apostate. It's much worse. If you're always a conservative, they hate you less. If they thought you were once their guy, like you were the ones doing the green cars, and then you turn out to support a Republican, wow, do they come for you? The left hates an apostate like that, but it's a sign of their ideological weakness and inability to accept reality, in my view.
Well, they're not about to accuse you of being an apostate anytime soon, Douglas.
No.
Thank you very much for coming on Spectator TV.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
Douglas, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.
Very good to be here live.
Good to see you. You write in your column this week about a remarkable incident when you think back in 2009 when a Dutch politician, who certainly wasn't as big then as he is now, was denied entry to the UK. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, I remember the affair very well. Geert Wilders, who was then already a member of the Parliament in the Netherlands, was meant to come to the UK, had been invited to give a speech at the House of Lords by a couple of peers, and he was turned away at the border. And this was quite an insult. I mean, I don't think that people quite realised at the time. The Dutch ambassador turned up at the airport, and it's a serious matter they regard as an insult. But he was turned away because the then Labour Home Secretary, Jackie Smith, had decided that he should not be allowed to enter the country because his views on Islam could be not conducive to the public good. And I said at the time, that's why I mentioned it in the piece, I said at the time to Jackie Smith and to the people who supported her move, what'll you do when Wilders is Prime Minister? Mm. Now, Wilders is not quite Prime Minister, but he overwhelmingly won the number of seats at the Dutch elections last November. He's putting together a government. The main centre-right party, the VVD, is going in with him. And I just think it throws up, as I say in my piece, a very interesting question, which is, in Britain, we have been very, very much misjudging what has been going on the continent for a long time now. And one of the oddities is that the people who present themselves as most Europhile are the ones who've actually ignored the developments the most.
And it's not just Wilders as well, you say in your piece. No. Can you give some other examples there? I think you mentioned, for example, the national conference which Daniel Kaczynski went to.
Yes, I was at a conference with Daniel Kaczynski in Rome in 2020. And there were representatives of all the main conservative governments across Europe. Viktor Orban was there, and Giorgia Meloni was one of the speakers. And Daniel Kaczynski, Matteo Salvini was meant to be there, then didn't actually turn up in the end, but he was a much more prominent figure at the time, having been interior minister in Italy. Daniel Kaczynski almost had the conservative whip withdrawn. Certainly people like Margaret Hodge of the Labour Party called for him to have the whip withdrawn. Members of his own party called for it. Because Daniel Kaczynski had appeared at a conference with these right-wingers from the continent. And I remember saying the same thing then. What's going to happen when Giorgia Meloni is Prime Minister? Well, we actually got the answer because 3 years after the conference, Giorgia Meloni is just around the corner from here on Downing Street, kissing Rishi Sunak, and both of them talking about how wonderful the relationship is between Italy and the UK. Again, you could see this coming. But on that occasion, it was even faster, because that was just 3 years between you're not allowed in a room with this woman to Prime Minister Meloni, how wonderful to see you. Again, it's a terrible misjudgment that's been going on in this country. The continent is turning right. And not in the way that the BBC, for instance, would like to portray it as, the right is marching, on the march. They always say the right is on the march. The left is never on the march, it seems. They just slope or something. But they want to run the right is on the march pieces. This isn't that. This isn't fascism or anything like that. But it is a definite move. When you get Meloni in Italy, of course, Central and Eastern European countries we know about. You have the AfD in Germany, which is a very, very complicated one, and is definitely a number of things. But you have Wilders in the Netherlands. You have the expectation that Marine Le Pen's party is going to come out on top at the European elections this weekend. And what is in the offing is a new group that Ursula von der Leyen may well have to work with or find a way to run with, which will be dominated by political parties that both centrist conservatives and the Labour Party in this country have demonized as being outrageous far-right parties, when in actual fact these parties have been reflecting the immigration concerns and the security concerns that are overwhelmingly shifting politics across the European continent.
I was going to ask you this. So do you think it's a misjudgment in terms of the politicians they were judging? So perhaps say Jackie Smith now or Margaret Hodge will say, well, even if they were going to become successful, the likes of Wilders and Meloni, they were beyond the pale then, therefore we should have treated them in this way. Do you think, and they would maybe argue now, oh, these politicians have detoxified and changed, take Le Pen and her party, for example. Do you think there's anything to that?
Well, there is always give and take. Le Pen has obviously detoxified her party very significantly, although, there's a sort of, around the margins still there can be a slightly vitiate smell. Wilders certainly has said things that no British politician would say. But, I was in Paris a couple of days ago and with French centrist and left-wing politicians, all of whom say things that no Conservative in the UK would say. I mean, former Prime Minister Manuel Valls, who's a leftist, who I saw the other day, when he was Prime Minister, he said things that the right of the Tory party would balk at. Why? Because they've got a serious demographic and immigration and illegal immigration issue and a serious security concern. People don't realize that ahead of the Olympic Games in Paris,
of course, yeah.
the city is in very near lockdown in the center. They just thwarted another plot to carry out a terrorist attack during it. Everybody is on the edge about it. That's why the situation in the country changed and politicians changed in response. I think it's very interesting that Britain is the outlier in this, mainly, of course, because of the ignominious behavior of the Conservative Party for the last 14 years. They're almost certainly going to be booted out of power. But it means that Britain will be the only party, I think, in the West that will be electing a left-wing government. As I say, that's because of the idiocy of the Tories. But nevertheless, it's very interesting because everywhere else, people are actually in the political class reacting to the deep sociological changes and security changes that are going on in our societies. British politicians don't, in the main, have the guts to do that. But their continental contemporaries, they do.
And you're right, it's going to be a very interesting dynamic when we have a Labour government in power dealing with a Europe that they couldn't be more ideologically opposed to. How do you think they're going to handle that?
I think it's a great cosmic joke. It's another recommendation about the existence of the deity. I mean, they will have. I mean, again, it goes back to my Jackie Smith example. Mm-hmm. Who do you want to deal with? Who do you think is kosher, as it were? Mm. And the answer for a lot of them is sort of nobody. As I say in the piece, maybe if Donald Trump wins the election in November, it'll be rather funny seeing, presumably, Foreign Secretary David Lammy, who said so many unpleasant things about Trump in the past. It'll be rather interesting seeing David Lammy trying to deal with him. I don't think Trump will be very forgiving about it.
Yeah, I was going to say, what do you think Trump will make of that?
Trump remembers slights. Yeah. He remembers them very, very well and long. So it'll be interesting. As I say in the piece, maybe the Labour government will end up in the strange position of not wanting to speak to any foreigners. It would seem rather xenophobic to me, but it might be the situation they get themselves into.
After this weekend, we're obviously expecting big European election results. Do you think that's going to change Europe in a dramatic way, or do you think this is more just of an indication of where the continent is heading more generally?
It's an indication of where the continent is heading. I think that many of the countries I've been to recently in Europe, people regard the Euros as something like the equivalent of the American midterms. You know, it's quite an effective way to punish the people in power. And of course, turnout everywhere is, as we know in this country, when we were still voting in EU elections, turnout is woeful in most countries. But nevertheless, European Parliament has a lot of power and influence. If there is, for instance, a right-wing bloc that can make some kind of agreement on international protocols about migration and so on, and things could change. But I'm not optimistic about that simply because I've seen quite a lot of politicians who've wanted to do something about that come and go. And some of them, as I've said in the magazine before, some of them even get prosecuted for doing the right thing, like Matteo Salvini was in Italy, accused of kidnapping for stopping one of the illegal boats from landing, and the wonderful Inger Støjberg in Denmark, who had an ankle bracelet because of doing something completely reasonable in 2015 and trying to stop illegal migration to her country. So, in Europe, quite often doing the right thing leads to bad ends for you, whereas doing the wrong thing, as so many of our politicians have, sees you glide off into a perfectly well remunerated retirement.
I was going to suggest maybe is this why the sort of populist right is doing so well now, is that they've had such sort of treatment from institutions within Europe. A lot have had brush with the criminal law, perhaps. Do you think that's why they're doing so well now, that people sort of look at that and say, you've been dealt with unfairly?
It's possible. I mean, Wilders has been repeatedly threatened with prosecution and prosecuted in the Netherlands for so-called hate speech. One of the cases against him related to a rally in a previous election in which he asked the crowd, do you want more Moroccan immigration or less? And they chanted less or fewer. I can't remember what exactly the word was in Dutch. But the point is that he was prosecuted over that. Well, but that's absurd, because that means that if you ask people if they want more Moroccans in their society or not, the only legal answer is yes, more, which is not sustainable either as a policy or as a political strategy.
And you mentioned, we in Britain seem to be the outlier here in Europe. At this time, it definitely seems because of the sort of the incompetence of the Conservatives. Yeah. But when the rest of Europe is sort of going this way, do you think at any point it could happen here as well? I mean, we've had Nigel Farage announce his candidacy this last week. Well,
I mean, it's rather hard for me to analyse that, because I've got what I would like to see happen and what may happen. I've always had the view that it's possible that in Britain, migration would only be sorted out by a left-wing government. I mean, it was a left-wing government that gave us the worst migration of recent times, but the Conservatives gave them a run for their money, gave the Blairs a run for the money. But in a way, because the right says it wants to do things and then is incompetent, then pays the political price for saying they want to do it and doesn't get it done. And so it's the worst of all worlds. Britain is an anomaly at the moment, because we have several different things that are cutting through at different angles through the political process. I would like to see a real response to what is going on. I don't think that the immigration levels that the Conservative Party has left us with are remotely sustainable. I don't want Britain to be bringing in 1 million people a year. I don't want to see the countryside even more bulldozed over and flattened out and rather ugly development sites put on. I'd quite like my country to remain recognisable. And I think that's a sentiment shared by a majority of the public, according to all polls. And yet, what I've just said is not something that the Conservative Party can say or do anything about, and it's not something the Labour Party can say or do anything about yet. We are an anomaly like that. Maybe Farage will blow it up. I mean, the Conservatives have blown themselves up. It'll be very hard to know what remains of them after the election. But it's a bizarre situation historically to end up in. The only country going to the left, and with real ignoramuses at the top. I can never get over the fact that David Lammy seems to believe that a man can grow a cervix if he takes the right medication.
And a man who was campaigning for us to rejoin the EU at one point. Now there's the irony there, isn't
yes, absolutely. I mean, the irony of a Labour government which is almost certainly going to try to drag us back into the common market or something, some kind of back door or side door. The irony of that party wanting to pull us back into a Europe which they don't like. As I say, it's like a divine joke.
So, Douglas, there's a new honours list out. What did you make of it?
Well, as I say in the piece, James, I expected by the time it went to press that probably you've now been elevated to the House of Lords. You can tell me during the course of this interview if you've had that happy news. It's really just the observation that whenever I leave the UK and come back, every time I come back, there's another honours list. And the quality of the peers seems to me to be ever diminishing. As I say in the piece, there's every reason to have an upper house, a legislative chamber, which oversees legislation, looks through bills, but comes at it with forms of expertise and types of expertise that maybe don't exist in the House of Commons. Yet what we see with the latest honours list is yet more people being put into the House of Lords who are simply political functionaries. In several cases, people who simply never made it to the House of Commons. Now, there's a good reason that if you've distinguished yourself in the House of Commons, you've been, for instance, Home Secretary or Prime Minister even, that you should end up in the House of Lords because you've got, presumably, hopefully, some political wisdom. But the idea that people who never made it anywhere near there but are political animals through and through, who've lived their life in politics, have anything much to add other than being a sort of B team of the House of Commons, strikes me as just being a very sad state of affairs, and all parties are responsible for it.
Yes, I remember last year when Boris Johnson's honours list came out, and our colleague Freddie Gray turned to me and said, "Oh, you know you failed when people younger than you start getting honours." I didn't expect that to happen quite so quickly to me. I'm 28, and one of these new Plaid Cymru peers is 27, so I'm over the hill.
Yes. And let's just, by the way, look at how distinguished or otherwise her career is. I haven't heard of her before, which is why I had to look her up. She is 27, Carmen Smith, and she never made it as an MP in Westminster. She never made it as a member of the Welsh Assembly. She was simply a political staffer in Wales. Now, I have seen cases before. There was a Lib Dem councillor who got elevated to the upper house some years ago, and I remember thinking, there goes the neighbourhood. But to have a Plaid Cymru MP, a staffer, sorry, I keep saying it, in the expectation that she'd be more distinguished, the idea that a political staffer should end up there is really an insult. And it's an insult not least, I mean, I'm sure she's perfectly nice, so actually I don't know that. She's a Welsh nationalist. But I'm assuming she's perfectly nice. But among other things, she's obviously she cannot be distinguished in any way. And she's now got a job for life in the upper house. And, may she live a long life. But if she does, we're going to be paying for her to be in the upper house for maybe 60 years. And she will have us vote on legislation that affects all of us. And, the political parties bandy around stuff about reform of the upper house. They clearly never really mean it because they never really know what to do, as I've explained before in my column. But this is just party after party really demeaning the standing of the peers.
And you mentioned there one nationalist, Welsh nationalist, who is the only nominee. So I'm not sure what it says about the rest of the talent in Plaid Cymru. Wow. But you also go through, Douglas, some of the others on this list. Could you just talk us through them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's one the Conservatives have put in who is a former MP, very undistinguished. He has edited a political website for the last 15 years, and now he's in the upper house. So he never made it to ministerial rank, but he did make it to a website, and now he's in the Lords. There's another person who was a perfectly nice person, who was an advisor to Harriet Harman and Ed Miliband. She's a couple of years older than me, James. Once again, somebody in her 40s in this case. So we might have her for another 40 years or so in the House of Lords. And she, I think it's arguable that Harriet Harman could go into the House of Lords one day. It's arguable that Ed Miliband could, given that he was a leader of the opposition and was, as Labour leader, was a terrific asset, of course, to the Conservative Party. Sure, Harriet Harman and Ed Miliband someday. But somebody who was an advisor to them, and who is, by the way, her main qualification that she touts of herself is that she was once named in 2017 by Ian Dale 75th most influential person on the left. Now, what is one to say, James? My point is not to insult any of these particular people. It's simply to point out these are all just political beasts of the nationalist parties, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party. They're all just political operatives. None of them bring anything to the upper house of experience in, for instance, small business or big business, or how to be a successful entrepreneur in the UK. They have no expertise in the sciences, in mathematics, in academia, in history, or anything else. They're simply all rather low grade, I have to say, political operatives. And so exactly what is it that they're going to bring to the deliberative process of the upper house? An upper house which already has, by everyone's recognition, far too many members. and which is now, I think, the largest legislative chamber in the world. I'm told it's even bigger now than the Chinese Politburo's official overseeing body. And I mean, maybe there's an excuse if you've got 1 billion people you're trying to keep in some kind of despotic rule. The idea that a democracy needs almost 800 peers in its second chamber seems to me not just ridiculous, but unbelievably wasteful.
And just as a final question, Douglas, you mentioned in the column that for you it's a hereditary earldom or nothing. I've got to ask, have you ever been offered a peerage of any kind?
I can answer you absolutely honestly, James. As I mentioned in the piece, there's always a risk when mentioning this. If as you will also have discovered, there are sometimes days, particularly if you're in Westminster ever, when you wonder whether or not you're the only commoner you know. I mentioned, of course, there are some people who would interpret that as sour grapes. They might be thinking, Douglas just wants to be Lord Murray. Nothing less. And I explain why in the piece. I would definitely not be gunning for that. As I say, my response on the few occasions when I felt somebody playing political footsie with me, which is usually along lines of hoping that you'll get in line in some way and not be bothersome or be independent thinking. My traditional line has always been the same. Yes, it's a hereditary earldom or nothing. As P.G. Woodhouse's Uncle Fred says, when you've got an earl, you're really onto something. Earls are hot stuff.
Well, for now, plain old Mr. Douglas Murray, thank you very much.